Good morning. Welcome to our final day. I'm Corey Rosen. I'm the founder of the National Center for Employee Ownership. And because the theme of what I'm going to be talking about this morning is stories, I want you to do something that every speaker in the world wishes that you wouldn't, which is to look at your phones while I'm talking. And what I want you to do is type in Corey Rosen storyteller. So type that in. And my guess is, if you're like everybody else who I've asked to do this, that Corey Rosen storyteller will come up, and it's not me. And not only is it not me, but he also lives in San Francisco, in the San Francisco area where I live. And he was performing at a local theater. He's quite well known, actually. He's also a scriptwriter. A lot of people go to see these storytelling things that he does. And so my wife and I, of course, went. And afterwards, I walked up and I said, "Hi, Corey Rosen. I'm Corey Rosen." And he said, "Oh, you're that Corey Rosen." So for the next 28 minutes and 38 seconds, I'm also going to be Corey Rosen storyteller. And I'm going to talk about the importance of stories in three ways. The first is this concept that we are the stories we tell about ourselves. I was reading a novel once, and that was the epigram that started off a chapter. And you know, sometimes when you're reading something and you read a sentence and it really lands, and you have to stop reading and just think about that for a minute. And I thought, that's really true. You know, from the time we're little kids, we're telling stories about ourselves. You know, when I was a little kid, that was a very long time ago. When I was a little kid in the early 1950s, I would go back into the backyard, and I was a train engineer. Now, that was a thing kids wanted to be at the time. And that was a story I told about myself. And if you watch kids playing sports, for instance, little kids, they're often narrating the game for themselves. They're pretending they're someone. And we never lose that as we grow up. We continue to tell stories to ourselves about who we are. These stories can be, as I will describe, they can be constraining, they can be inspiring, and sometimes they can be wrong. So when I was growing up most of my life, which I will include until my mid-40s, the story I told about myself was that I was a pretty shy person. I went into academia in part like a lot of academics, because one of the good things about academics is you get to talk to people who have to be there listening to you. And I was very nervous about meeting people I didn't know. My nightmare scenario, some people I've heard the most feared thing in the world is speaking. That never bothered me. But going into a room of people I didn't know, that was terrifying. And so I was in this position where I was often in rooms with people I didn't know, and it was difficult. So one day, I was flying back from a meeting, and the flight was canceled. It was late at night. The airline put us up at local hotels, and they put us in a limousine because they were trying to commandeer every vehicle they could to get us to these sometimes fairly far away hotels. And I was in one of these stretch limousines, and there were two people on either side of me and three people facing me. Well, that was my nightmare scenario. And so I decided, I'm tired of this. I'm going to do what I know I see people doing, which is you ask people questions and then they talk about themselves and you're off to the races. So I did that and it worked. And I thought, oh, that was easy. And the story about myself changed after that. When I started the center, my story was I'm a one-time academic. I'm interested in policy, but I'm also interested in research. And so we're going to create an organization that will do high-quality research to provide objective, reliable information about employee ownership. And that would be the story of the organization. And it was for many years. But over time, as we grew, what members needed from us changed. And the organization changed. The story that I was telling myself didn't quite fit. After 30 years, I stopped being the director. Lauren became the director. And Lauren had a different story. And that was one of the best decisions that I made, was to stop being director so that we could move in a different direction, because that story about ourselves was constraining our growth. And sometimes when we think about our own companies, particularly when you think about what have we been doing, what's the story of our company year after year, we find that sometimes there's a disconnect between what that story is and what the market needs and what your employees need. The third issue with stories is that, and this is the most important one, is sometimes the story you tell about your company, the way that you relate to other people in the company, the success of your company in creating ownership cultures, does not really describe you. And so in the eyes of the leadership of the company, maybe you're this high involvement, high engagement culture where people really have the opportunity to think and act like owners. You have an open door policy that never quits. Anybody with a closed door policy? I don't see any hands going up. So just save those words. Just say you're a company. If you say you're a company, it implies you're an open door company because everybody says they are. And so you say, well, that's the story of our company. That's the way we work. But then if you go listen to employees tell you what they think the story of employee ownership in your company is, it's not the same story. They don't see things the same way. That disconnect is one of the biggest barriers to creating really effective ownership cultures. So what can you do about rethinking that story? Well, as we heard yesterday when we did a session on this, one of the attendees said, you know, that was really true in our company. And he was the branch manager of about a 75 employee branch of this large employee ownership company. And he said, so instead of going and talking to people to tell them what our story is, I went to them each individually and asked them, tell me what the story of employee ownership is about us in your mind. And that listening opened up a lot of new ideas, and at least, the very least, it gave people a sense that they were genuinely being heard. Well, that's a good start, but the next step is to say, well, if we're going to really change the story, can we do that by exhortation and encouragement? Can we just say, well, we really encourage you to share your ideas and identify problems? And that doesn't work very well either, because it's too ambiguous to say, we would like you to do this, we encourage you to do this, you're owners, you should do this. And I'm an employee and I'm thinking, well, when do I do it? Do I just walk in that open door and give my idea? Do I have any authority to actually just make the decision? It's not clear to me exactly how I do this, and so I don't do it. So you need to move beyond allowing it. You need to move past encouraging it. You need to structure it. You need to create specific systems where employees are having regular conversations with each other about work, and those conversations are informed by sharing enough information about all the metrics that are involved in their work so that they can make good decisions. It's a long process to learn to do this, to get good at it, but it's the only way that story will change. So I really encourage you to take those steps. Many of you have, but not everybody. It also comes from the stories that leadership tells about what matters in the company. Jack Stack is the CEO of SRC Holdings, one of the truly iconic ESOP companies. Became an ESOP in 1983. They had 119 employees and they were not in good financial shape. Jack became the CEO. He's still the CEO 43 years later. They now have 2,000 employees and their stock price has gone up over 1,000,000%. And one of Jack's core principles is that leadership has to be humble. It has to be genuinely willing to do two things. One, to genuinely listen to people, and two, to genuinely believe that your ideas aren't always right. That's tough for a lot of leaders because they became leaders because they did have good ideas. So what kind of stories does leadership tell its employees? Are they heroic stories about the great things you've done? Or are they stories like Jack's, where he said, during one of the recessions they've been through, the company makes re-engineers engines for heavy-duty trucks and construction and things like that. And that's very subject to a recession because there's less use of those. So he's walking through the plant and a janitor walks up to him and says, "Jack, our strategy's not right. You know, it's a recession. People aren't going to be rebuilding trucks as much as they used to. But what do they do in a recession? People rebuild their own trucks and their own cars. Businesses might not, but people don't want to buy a new truck. So we should be getting into that business of rebuilding those truck engines." Now, two things are really important about that story, and Jack tells it all the time. Number one is that Jack listened to it, and he said, I went back to my management team and I said, "Hey, you know, the janitor just told me we should be doing this, and I think it's a great idea." And they did do it, and they got them through the recession. But the other thing that was really important about that is that the janitor was willing to tell him that in the first place. How many companies would that be true? And that didn't happen simply because Jack's a humble guy and genuinely walks the talk. That was part of it, that Jack told those stories all the time. But the other part is they had established this great game of business structure where every employee from the janitor to the CEO was learning about the numbers and talking about the numbers and was genuinely feeling empowered to share ideas. Relatedly, and we heard this yesterday in the talk, that leaders often want to say, "Tell me your solutions." That's good, but a lot of times people don't have solutions, but they've identified problems. And that notion of, if you don't have a solution, don't bother me with the problem, is like saying, "Gee, I smell the gas leaking. I don't know how to turn the gas off, so I probably shouldn't tell anybody." Not a good idea. We also hear about stories in the context of founders. Many years ago, I was listening to a speech like this at another conference, and the speaker said something that really stuck with me. He said, you want to think about your life in terms of asking, what do I want to be remembered for? And some people want to be remembered because they were really rich, they were powerful, they were really good at what they did. Most people want to be remembered for what they did for other people. What did I contribute for my community, for my family? How did I help my employees? How did I make life better for other people? That's what most of us want to be remembered for. But sometimes, although that's the story we would like other people to tell about us after we're gone, we might forget about that in our daily actions. When we think about employee ownership, I think this really resonates because many of us are here because somebody at some point said the story I want to tell about my company and myself is not that I sold it to private equity or some consolidator for some huge amount of money and we got really, really rich. No, the story I want to tell is that I turned that over to my employees and they really thrived. That's what makes me feel good. That's what I want to be remembered for. So tell those origin stories, not just when you do your ESOP, but come back and tell them over and over again, 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later. Those origin stories really resonate. One of our members, Pacific Steel Recycling, used to be a company that many, many years ago was dealing with animal hides. So they've been around for a long time. And their founder, way back in the, I think, early 19th century, they found a picture of him. And they used AI, because of course he was long gone, a picture of him talking about the history of the company all the way through to the sale of the ESOP. So you see this guy and they animate the picture. It looks like he's talking about the origin story of the company and saying, I think this ESOP thing is really a great idea. Well, you might not do that, but if your founder's still around, take a video of your founder talking about why he or she did that and keep that video in front of people over the years. The second part of stories that's important is what stories do we tell about other people? And how does that affect the way we relate to them? So when I was a college professor in the 1970s, after a couple years I decided I was teaching political science. I'd rather be involved in it than teaching it. I applied for a fellowship to work in the Senate. I got that, got involved in employee ownership, and now there's the National Center for Employee Ownership. But before that, I could teach one last seminar. And I told the students in this seminar at the beginning, small college, I already had taught most of them. And the story we told as professors on that faculty, which was a small college, Ripon College, in Ripon, Wisconsin, which is just north of here, that most of the kids in this school were from the Chicago and Milwaukee suburbs. They really were in college mostly because that's what you did after high school. They were not too enthused about doing their homework and didn't often do it, in fact. And they weren't very motivated. And I kind of bought into that too, to be honest. But that last course, small class, I said, I'm going to give every one of you an A. Whether you come to class or not, whether you write the papers I'm going to ask you to write or not, and no matter how well you do, you're all going to get an A. I guarantee it. And they believed me. Well, an interesting thing happened. These were students of very mixed abilities. I asked them to write a paper every week. That seemed daunting to most people, but they did. Not only did they write it, and not only did they always come to class, but they would circulate each other's paper to one another for comments. And then they started bringing food on an alternating basis. Each week, somebody else would be responsible for bringing the donuts or the cookies. We had really lively discussions. At the end of the year, every one of those students deserved an A. Every one of those students did all the reading. Every one of those students handed in their papers on time. And I said at the end, what happened? This was great. And they said, well, your expectation of us, the story that you told about us, is that we could be really good students. We could be really engaged. And we wanted to live up to that expectation. So, what story do you tell about the people you work with? Does the story you tell about them limit what they're able to accomplish because you've defined them in a way that limits them? When I started many years ago doing a game we call Harry the Horse, which is an exercise we do to teach people how valuations are done. It's very interactive. You can look it up on our website. And I was doing it with CFOs, I was doing it with factory workers, and I remember going to a company that asked me to do this. It was a warehouse, and a bunch of guys are coming up in their motorcycles, and high school educated people mostly, and we just started doing this. And I thought, well, I wonder how this is going to go. And these people were talking about, well, you have to consider the time value of money and, excuse me, alternative investments and risk levels. And maybe when we sell the company, part of it could be on a contingency basis. And if ever I needed dispelling the notion that ordinary employees could understand financials, that did it. But the expectation that people have in many companies, the story you tell about employees, is I won't be interested in this, it's too complicated, it's too difficult. Well, a lot of these people can tell you in detail about sports statistics. Business numbers aren't any more complicated. It has a lot to do with what you try to teach them, but I think even more to do with what the story you tell yourself about what they can do. This also manifests itself when we're talking to people, and we've all done this, I've done it, I'm guilty of it, I admit, but I suspect you all are too. You're talking to someone, and maybe it's a somewhat fraught conversation, and you're thinking, I know what you're really thinking. I know what your motives are. You're saying this, but you're just saying that. That's not what you really think. Has anybody ever not done that? Has anybody ever gone through your whole life without ever doing that? And what happens when you do? Is the other person happy about that? Or do they tell you in no uncertain terms you have no idea what you're talking about? Once you've done that, you've created a really toxic relationship. But all of us do that all the time. Well, the opposite of that is to stop telling yourself stories about what you think they're doing. You don't know. And so instead, try to approach that with openness, with active listening, with appreciation, with genuinely being interested in what they say they're thinking, what they say their motivations are. Try it. It makes life immensely easier. There's a wonderful book that was really life-changing, literally, for me, called Leadership and Self-Deception. And it's about that way that we relate to people and the problems it creates. I highly recommend it. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. And the argument is, the way they put it, it's a convenient way to think of it, is we put people in a box. The box that's constrained by the story that we tell about them. And if we remove that box, great things can happen. So this happened when I was 10, 15 years into the organization. And I had this notion that we were going to be a consensually run organization, and we were going to make decisions as a group, and I would have staff meetings and I would sit down and say, well, here's how I think about the problem. Remarkably, almost every time, people ended up at the same place that I was in terms of what we should do. Was that a good thing? That was a terrible thing. Because the whole point was not to do that. And one day, one of our employees who's still with us said to me, Corey, the way we're doing our publications is awful. You know, they were done very cheaply. He said, we need to really make these more professional. And I was just tired that day, and I said, oh, all right, just let's try that. Well, turned out we were selling a lot more publications after that, and people thought much better of us, and I was totally wrong. So that story I told myself about what these other people were doing when we had these meetings, I realized if I was wrong about that, I was probably wrong about a lot of other things, and I wasn't building consensus, I was managing consent. And if I really wanted to get people's ideas, I needed to stop saying, well, this is what I think, what do you think? I needed to say, what do you think? And not start with that. Finally, I want to close with encouraging you to tell your story to the broader public. And we've got, of course, the expanding ESOPs effort. Still, you have the opportunity to go do that. Tell your story. It's a great way to do it through them. They make it easy. But tell your story to your colleagues. If you are a business leader, make an effort to go tell your colleagues in your field about what employee ownership has meant for you. Write an op-ed for your local newspaper. This is actually probably the most effective thing you can do. Talk to your trade association and say, hey, could we do a panel on employee ownership? It's really worked for us. Talk to your local state legislator about creating a state program. Tell your story to as many people as you can, because the only way this idea is going to grow is if you tell those stories. Well, finally, I just want to close by thanking, first of all, our staff. It's an amazing thing that these 4 staff people run this meeting this well. So, amazing job, Maria, Ava, Jamie, and Megan, and really all of the 25 folks on our staff. I'm really proud to say that in the last 5 years, not a single person has left the NCEO. And that's amazing. And we have a staff of exceptionally qualified, dedicated, nice people trying to move this forward. But most importantly, I want to thank all of you. I've been doing this now, will be my 49th year by the time we get to December. And I literally wake up every day feeling grateful to be able to do this, to have a sense of purpose, and to be involved with a community of such caring, sharing, and giving people. What you do is amazing, and I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the conference.